All right, everybody. Good morning. Can you hear me? Last day. Can you believe this? Day 5. And I'm reminded that you have exams this afternoon. So I'll begin here at 9:40. We'll end at 10:40, and then you'll have a break. Then Dr. Tolio will present. So we'll make sure we get your certificates in your hands and you on your way. But I just wanted to thank you so much for being here today. This is our last day, day 5, part 2 on trauma representation and the COVID pandemic. So trauma theory in the 21st century. We're shifting to lecture 13, how the birth of modernism and the Spanish flu resonate today. And I'm picking up where we left off with our critic, Alexandra Alter, who, remember, writing for the New York Times in February of 2022, said, this is a quote from yesterday, "The PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, we're all going to have is not only going to affect how it's written about, but whether or not anyone will want to read about it," said the writer Tom Bissell, who advised novelists to steer clear of the topic in an essay for the Los Angeles Times. Quote, "When you have a horrible global experience in which millions of people have died, what is there to explore artistically other than the fact that it was terrible?" So again, we've been talking a lot, not only about trauma in content, but also trauma in style, in representation. So the question is not only how do you write the pandemic, but Tom Bissell is saying here, do you even want to? What can you say besides it was terrible, and it was? But this is the part that interested me, and we didn't spend a lot of time talking about this quote yesterday. Alter picks up where Tom Bissell leaves off and says, quote, "Very little noteworthy fiction was written in direct response to the 1918 flu, which killed an estimated 50 million to 100 million people, but left barely a mark in the literary record. Most writers at the time avoided the topic or referenced it only obliquely, perhaps because it followed on the heels of World War I, and unlike a rousing war story, an invisible virus that strikes indiscriminately doesn't make for a dramatic narrative." My question is this really true? Was there really so little fiction or poetry written in direct response to the 1918 flu? Or, as Elizabeth Autka says, was it written about, but not framed as being about the flu, so we completely missed it on our first readings? She says it was interesting, more interesting maybe, to write about and read about a rousing World War I story than it is to read about people being sick in hospital or in their homes. So what we're going to do today is look at 4 passages from canonical British modernist literature. And the first thing I'm going to do is read it as though it was written in direct response to the war. This is how I learned about British modernism, a response to World War I. And what Autka is saying in conversation with Alter is, if we reread it, if we look at the same language from the perspective of a worry about death from illness, we can see that perhaps more writers were writing about the flu pandemic than we originally thought. At first, Elizabeth Autka, author of Viral Modernism, The Influenza Pandemic and Interwar Literature. You have the introduction to her book in your packet if you're interested. She seems to emphasize this claim that Alter makes, which is so little was written in response to the flu of 1918. The flu drops out of the cultural memory, she says. She writes this book to investigate a modernist mystery. Why does the deadly 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic seem to make so few appearances in British, Irish, and American literature of the period? Is it a mystery? Like, let's think about 100 years ago, another deadly pandemic that affected people in perhaps similar ways to how we were affected. I wonder, how is it possible that that did not make it into more pages, kind of written by these canonical authors? After all, Auka points out that many modernist writers contracted the flu themselves, or someone they love contracted the flu, or they lost somebody to the flu. Gustav Klimt, for example, died from the flu. D.H. Lawrence, Catherine Ann Porter, the poet H.G., Edvard Munch, W.B. Yeats, Nella Larson, Thomas Wolfe, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, they all had a direct connection to this flu. You would think they would write about it, says Autka, like the Lear effect we discussed yesterday. Shakespeare, Tony Kushner were both writing their best work in the middle of the plague, a plague. And I just want to pause here to say Autka's book, I feel obligated to mention, was first published in October of 2019, about 5 months before the COVID lockdown in the United States. So it is not that Autka was looking at coverage of the pandemic of our century, thinking that it resonated with the modernist fiction and poetry of the previous century. Rather, Autka saw a gap, and given the nature of the repetition of history, only seems to have once again uncannily foretold the language of the pandemic yet to come. I think all of us, kind of scholars of trauma and narrative medicine, didn't discover this book until maybe April of 2020. And we're like, amazing, how did she get this book out so fast? A pandemic book. And it turned out that she had been writing about it in 2018, 2019, published it in 2019. And when you think about that, this pandemic book looking at a deadly flu was written and published 5 months before another deadly pandemic. So in this introduction, Autka says, quote, "Despite the pandemic's seeming disappearance, its traces are everywhere in the literature and the culture, and this instructive tension lies at the heart of her book. All the reasons for erasure, from the war's dominance to the inevitable quality of this viral threat to the difficulty of representing illness, are intrinsic to the pandemic's literary representations, paradoxically captured in gaps, silences, atmospheres, fragments, and hidden bodies." This is language that we discussed on day one. Remember, 5 days ago, we thought about how traumatic history found its way into literature through gaps, through silences, through repetition, through all these kind of failures that tell us that something traumatic has just happened. So we're going to go back to look at modernist literature and see if we can find the flu, the influenza pandemic from 1918 written in those texts. To this insight into the difficulty of representing illness, and there is a whole section in her introduction called Representing Illness, which quotes from narrative medicine experts Priscilla Wald, Rita Sharon, whom we spent a lot of time talking about, Kathleen Conway. We might consider the difficulty of representing trauma also, a point Autka makes in the section of the introduction called pandemic flashback. That's another key trauma word. For Autka, as trauma research suggests, elements of a traumatic event later become the triggers that lead to flashback. Flashbacks are often bewildering, conjuring not the complete memory of the past event, but pieces of sensory details, emotional states, or bodily sensations. So in a little bit, I'm going to ask us to see if we can see pieces of sensory details, emotional states, bodily sensations represented in the great poetry of T.S. Eliot and the fiction of Virginia Woolf. It is not just the difficulty of writing trauma and illness that marginalizes flu representation. And Auka makes this final point in her introduction rather well. Drawing on Judith Butler's work, called Frames of War, we might reflect on the fact that pointing the modernist tradition toward seeing and valuing tropes of war was politically and culturally useful at the time. For Auka, at the political level, the pandemic's dead needed to be forgotten. They needed to become ungrievable, silenced, left out, to make room for the war's already uncountable dead. The pandemic became derealized and delegitimated, one of Butler's discarded negatives. So again, this is a matter of framing and teaching, right? Here we have this representation in these high modernist writers. Let's frame it as being about World War I. That seems politically and culturally useful at this time. Even if maybe evidence, close readings of the text would suggest otherwise. Maybe they were writing about the flu, but it was presented as being about the war. And of course, as I hear myself speak, I'm thinking it doesn't have to be either or. We've been doing these amazing explications, and you all have shown dozens of different ways of reading a single word. So, of course, that is an option to us. But I'm so interested in the fact that when professors in the 1990s presented high British modernist poetry and literature, they said this is about World War I. And Auka is coming in 2019 to say, why can't we read it as being about the flu or any other thing, right? Why the war? Why is it framed by the war, with the flu being a discarded negative, as Judith Butler would say? So since we are fresh from the discussion from yesterday about canon formation, which culture has the authority to center or privilege certain texts, to gatekeep, to decide what is effective or not effective as literature and on what grounds? I would like to dwell a bit longer on this idea of discarded narratives or discarded negatives. I will be dating myself, but in the 1990s and early 2000s, I learned that exemplary literature, such as novels by Virginia Woolf and the poetry of T.S. Eliot, were about the alienation, anomie, and sterility that came from witnessing World War I. We were talking about exams earlier. That is what I still have in my mind from preparing for exams on British modernism. Every British modernist text is about alienation, anomie, sterility, based, grounded in the experience of World War I. I feel like I was invited to read everything through this lens. The Wasteland was about the dearth of spiritual fortitude. The lack of water that Eliot obsesses about was not about feeling thirsty from sickness, but rather a lack of opportunity for cleansing baptism. And the same thing may be said for Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, that she had spiritual malaise and maybe even depression, because Virginia Woolf's depression too, leading up to her death, led to her death by suicide on the brink of World War II, because she found World War I intolerable and horrific. This is the narrative that I was presented. What Auka is inviting us to do is read these canonical modernist works with new eyes and see the ways that we thought were texts about war actually were, in fact, about the flu epidemic. That would explain in part the silence by showing there really never was silence. We just need to read into the gaps as we would any other text about trauma or illness. So I want to do that today with two passages from T.S. Eliot and two from Virginia Woolf, passages I used to teach about being about the sense of anomie, disillusionment, malaise that comes from living in and the wake of a world war. If we read them at another time, from the perspective of the flu pandemic, we can see perhaps how obvious it is that what is being described is not a culture in and after war, but a literal body that is literally sick in a culture in and after a flu pandemic. And this is what I think is so amazing about literary criticism, about close reading, about language. Like, trauma studies is nothing if not a theory about how to read, about how language works, about how language is as alive as we are alive. So this is Auka again from Viral Modernism. I love the title, by the way, Viral Modernism, right? When something goes viral, it spreads fast. And that is like what we associate with a virus, right? A virus literally spreading fast. And what would it mean to think about modernism as kind of defined by virus? When the pandemic is left out of critical discussions of the wasteland, for example, we miss a whole realm of ordinary, or at least widespread, experience. It leaves everyone else out, right? If you're interested in anything other than war. The poem registers the body's story in a way that we have missed, since that story is itself hidden on so many levels. The poem's language and structure speak to the body's infection, Auka says, delirium, fatigue, and suffering, the anxiety and terror and disrupted consciousness. And to give evidence, further support for her reading that these modernists, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, were writing about the virus, she talks about their experiences surviving the flu and other physical illnesses. She says Eliot and his wife both personally felt caught in a perpetual living death in the pandemic, post-pandemic moment. The seemingly endless cycles of illness, recovery, fatigue, and failure wore Eliot down until his nervous system collapsed. So again, like, we see signs of fatigue, of failure, repeated repetition of bodies and malaise. And Auka is saying, why don't we look through the frame of the flu? That seems to make sense, right? All right, so here is a very famous stanza from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. High modernist text, often taught as about spiritual loss. Where are we as a culture if we are living through and witnessing and perpetuating a world war? A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street. The way that I was taught to read this poem is to imagine people coming back from World War I those soldiers that Freud talked about in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, all of these hollowed out men who had seen horrific things in the trenches are coming home, if they can come home. And the question is, how do they pick up with their daily lives? And T.S. Eliot worked at a bank on the other side of the bridge. And the reading was, people thought Eliot was walking to work every day, passing the bridge, looking at these hollowed out men who had seen so much, survivors of war. Death by war had undone so many. Short sighs were exhaled from expressing trauma from the war. Each man fixed his eyes before his feet, looking at his feet, kind of trudging along, despondent, depressed. But now we have Autke's frame in our heads, right? Autke says, why can't we read this from the perspective of literal illness? And here I feel like I'm undoing everything that we said on day one, right? Like trauma is psychic. Trauma is an illness of the mind. And now in 2020, we have critics saying, let's go back to the physical body and think about how difficult it is to represent illness. So we're out of the head. We're kind of somehow out of a focus on the unconscious after a pandemic. All right, rereading. Let's shift the frame. Not war, flu. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street. That word death, undone, short sighs, exhales, flowed up the hill. Can you see how those now seem to refer to being undone by losing people from a literal flu and not war? Like obviously, as we've been saying, it can be both. It could be so many things, right? But I think it's really interesting and persuasive for Autke to say these men who seemed so hollowed out, and maybe women too, that T.S. Eliot was seeing crossing over London Bridge, were ravaged by the flu. And if that's the case, why have we not allowed that to enter the critical conversation about modernism? Here's another example she gives. Oh, sorry. So again, like I tend to read this on a metaphorical level. Bodily malaise, thirst, it all seems to do with a sense of looking for meaning, spiritual meaning in a world after war. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace reverberation, of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead, we who were living are now dying, with a little patience. Again, because of the way that criticism in the 1990s and early 2000s presented this, I see this as being a war poem. The sweaty faces, the frosty silence, the agony, the shouting and the crying. He who was living is now dead. That could be about witnessing, a friend kind of die in trench warfare. It could be about living spiritually and then dying spiritually. We who were living are now dying. I think someone said early on, we are always already dying with little patience. Spiritual malaise. Shift the frame. Imagine a sick body. Imagine T.S. Eliot being so wrecked by being so sick for so long. Imagine the physical experience of having the flu. Sweaty faces, frosty silence, agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying. He who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying. It seems like that could be about suffering through a flu. It seems like it could be about watching somebody you love suffer through the flu, maybe die from the flu. So again, now we have like the framework of war overlaid with the framework of flu. And we can go back to Alexandra Alter, who says nobody was writing about the flu pandemic. Why would we do that now? And Auke saying, yes, they were. You just haven't been looking. So Auke says the pandemic lens, which is the second one, right? Bodies are sick. How do you represent that? Also invites a shift in how we see one of the poem's defining features, that is the wasteland. Its ubiquitous fragments. Someone once said reading The Wasteland is like turning the dial on a radio, like you're kind of in and out, you have different voices, shift, 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 fragment, fragment. So often imagined as the aftermath of a bomb with the explosions of World War I, leaving behind these bits of cultural shrapnel. That's the form and content argument, right? This poem is about World War I. That's the content. It's fragmented because it is evoking a sense of fragments in the wake of explosions from World War I. However, she says, these fragments should also be seen as the aftermath of a proliferating viral catastrophe. We can imagine how fragmented writing would emphasize kind of fragmented viral transmission, she says. So now my favorite. I said we should kind of throw out the British canon if we need to, right? Like we don't have to go through like the list of the hierarchy, putting all British literature on top. But I will say that Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway is one of my favorite novels of all time. And she is not, like Mrs. Dalloway is not someone to aspire to. This was also kind of written in the wake of the Armenian genocide, right? And so Woolf is kind of making fun of the fact that Clarissa Dalloway doesn't know the difference between Albania and Armenia. But there's something about the way that she represents like internal despair that really resonates with me. So here is a famous passage. It is often read as a way to understand Mrs. Dalloway's depression. The sense that she is living through or has lived through a world war. It rasped her, though, to have stirring about her in this brutal monster, never to be content quite or quite secure, for at any moment the brute would be stirring this hatred, which, especially since her illness, had power to make her feel scraped, hurt in her spine, gave her physical pain, and made all pleasure and beauty in friendship, in being well, in being loved, and making her home a delightful rock quiver and bend as if indeed there were a monster grubbing at the roots. I don't know why, but I always thought these were metaphors for depression, making her feel scraped, hurt in her spine, physical pain, The evidence is there. It is about a body in pain. It is about a sick body. But for some reason, I think about brutal monster, the monster stirring hatred, the sense of that delightful rock quivering and bending as a way of describing how she feels in her head. That illness is right there, right? How she had been feeling since her illness. Autka is saying, like, all she is asking us to do is read this at the most literal level. Mrs. Dalloway is physically sick. It hurts her spine. So the monster grubbing at the roots, this brutal monster, doesn't not have to be depression. It could be the linger effects of the virus. It could be the virus itself. So I don't know why. Like that, it's like, that made my head just kind of go off. Okay. This is from the perspective of Peter, who was once very close to her. And he hears, so again, like the shifting perspectives, the fragmentation. Why can't this be about an attempt to represent the flu or illness, right? So this is Peter, who has heard the church bells go off. And one of the things Autka reminds us of is the bells are tolling all the time to honor the dead from the virus, the flu. And her friend is walking through the courtyard, hearing the bells toll, and is completely now locked in his head, in his like fantasy about what this could possibly mean. And it seems totally irrational on first reading. But then if you think about all the people who are dying from the flu in 1918 and 1919, his hysteria makes a kind of sense. But what room? What moment? And why had he been so profoundly happy when the clock was striking? Then as the sword of St. Margaret's languished, he thought, she has been ill. And the sound expressed languor and suffering. It was her heart, he remembered, and the sudden loudness of the final stroke told for death that surprised in the middle of life, Clarissa falling where she stood in her drawing room. No, no, he cried, she is not dead. He's thinking, my friend has been sick. My friend's heart is sick. I hear these bells tolling. What if it means that she has dropped dead? So again, if we shift to the flu narrative, we can see that this is a representation of Peter thinking, what if this bell tolling is a bell tolling for the death of my friend? And it's worth noting, again, if we kind of want to think about cultural context, we don't have to stop at World War I. We can think about how Virginia Woolf was sick with the flu. She published On Being Ill in 1926 in T.S. Eliot's journal, New Criticism. She wrote the essay following a parade of influenza encounters, that's Autka's phrase, as well as other illnesses, and during another lengthy sojourn in the sick room, she had fainted at one of her sister's parties. Virginia Woolf had fainted at one of her sister's parties. Her friend is saying, Clarissa falling where she stood in her drawing room, no. What if she fainted, like Virginia Woolf fainted from illness at her sister's party? So now I'm going to pivot. One of the second part of the talk was, how does it resonate today? So I wanted to use the lens that Autka gives us, these works published kind of in the middle of one crisis could also seem to be representing another crisis. And so to kind of come full circle with another of my favorite authors of all time is a discussion, a short discussion of Philip Roth's novel Nemesis, the very last novel that Philip Roth. And it was by reading the fiction of Philip Roth that I really understood how literary writers could attempt to write about historical trauma. And so I wanted to think about Roth's nemesis and Philip Roth's role in this tradition. He is the American author that I know best. And I wonder if we reframe modernist texts to see how the flu can be repositioned, may we do it for 21st century texts too. And I asked this question of my students in March of 2020, when we all went into lockdown, and I started to teach this text from 2010 called Nemesis, published a decade before. It is often read as an interpretation of a polio pandemic in urban areas, so in Newark, New Jersey for Roth. Again, before the virus, I anticipated a reading of the novel metaphorically. Roth seems, in so much of his work, to compare anti-Semitism to a virus spreading around the world in the 1930s and 1940s when the novel is set. I know some of you are working on Holocaust narratives, right? As schools and businesses shut down and people began to shelter in their homes, and Asian Americans began being attacked in the streets of the US, Nemesis weighed on our minds as scholars, teachers, and students. So Nemesis is a novel about a polio outbreak in Newark, New Jersey during World War II that turns on the idea of fear. Fear of catching polio, of children becoming paralyzed, of the vulnerable Jewish neighborhoods being blamed for the spread of the disease. But our subsequent return to the book reveals that it is not a book about fear, about perpetual fear so much, as it is also structured around the point of view of children who would ultimately carry much of the physical and emotional burden of unimaginable worldwide events. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it is about fear, but it is about a physical illness as well. So Nemesis is Roth's final novel, and in many ways a fitting end to his remarkable career. The book's title, Nemesis, is fitting in the sense that it imagines as our ultimate enemies doubt, fear, illness, and death. Its protagonist is Bucky Cantor, a playground director in Weequahic, Newark, New Jersey, during a fictional polio outbreak in the summer of 1944. And when I say fictional, I mean there were polio outbreaks everywhere before the vaccine, right? There was no such outbreak in Newark, but Philip Roth wondered what if there were. How would it affect the children that he grew up with? The novel traces the spread of fear and guilt as we ultimately learn that Bucky, the hero, blames himself for spreading the illness, from the neighborhood playground he left behind to the children attending Indian Hills summer camp in the Poconos, where he ultimately resides that summer. He's going to leave the place where the virus is spreading and go to the mountains, and guess what? It's a tragedy, so that he carries the virus with him and infects the children there. Even though the novel was published in 2010, I can say it was very strange rereading it in 2020, just as the nation was going into lockdown to prevent the spread of another unknowable and nearly unforeseen disease. The book's introductory chapter uncannily captures the fear of the unknown we were once again facing in 2020. As the novel's narrator tells us, there is so much people did not know. So again, this passage was published in 2010, and it is intended to represent the polio spread in the early 1940s before the vaccine. What people did know was the disease was highly contagious and might be passed to a healthy, but to the healthy by merely physical proximity to those already infected. For this reason, as the number of cases steadily mounted in the city and communal fear with it, many children in our neighborhood found themselves prohibited by their parents from using the big public pool at Olympic Park in nearby Irvington, forbidden to do the local air-cooled movie theaters, and forbidden to take the bus downtown or travel down Neck to Wilson Avenue to see our minor league team, the Newark Bears, play baseball at Rupert Stadium. These are the elements of childhood in the 40s in Newark. You go to baseball games, you go to the movies, you go to the playground. And parents, I don't know about your parents. In Connecticut in 2020, with my son home during lockdown, I was this fearful parent. I was this, you will not go out with your friends tonight. If you go to the park, you will wear a mask. Do not go to any public places. And kids, you know, are like, what? I'm a teenager. I need to be able to go out. So, like, this resonates with me, like this fear, like you will not go out because if you do, you may get sick. We know this virus is spreading. So the repetition of such words as contagion, infected, the phrase communal fear, suggests it is not only fear of the contagion of the virus that affects all of the community members of Wequahic, but also the fact that fear itself spreads, is contagious, and contributes to the disintegration of a community. Roth has said in interviews that he recalls wondering about all the fuss parents were making over their children, worried that the children would become ill by going out and doing everyday things like swimming in the neighborhood pool or going to the movies. The novel, reflected from the point of view of a grown man, but from the perspective of his childhood memories, reproduces that refracted fear that comes mostly from the parents, but affects every child's life in Newark and beyond. And I've already suggested that I'm obsessed with the figure of the child. That figure is everywhere in Nemesis. It's the children we have to look out for. In addition to the repeated representation of fear, here is also the repetition of the word forbidden in a catalog of all things children do, children who are supposed to be free and spirited in this summer. No sports, no movies, no swimming, no public transit. As with today, Roth depicts here an entire way of life shut down. The fear and resentment this leads to is only reinforced with the repetition of the plosive P, for my linguists, the plosive P, found in such words as past, proximity, prohibited, parents, public, pool, play, and Rupert. That seems to like reinforce this, you must not go out. In fact, the communal memory, the memory of we, the neighborhood children, continues to pile on the warnings children received from their parents or community leaders. We were warned not to use public toilets or public drinking fountains, or to swig a drink out of someone else's soda pop bottle, or get a chill, or play with strangers, or to borrow books from the library, or to talk on a public payphone, or buy food from a street vendor, or eat until we had cleaned our hands thoroughly with soap and water. We were to wash all fruit and vegetables before we ate them, and we were to keep our distance from anyone who looked sick or complained of any of polio's telltale symptoms. I read this as going so fast. We were told we were not to do this, and this, and this, and this. The repetition of the or here, the conjunction, connecting, all these things common to a childhood summer serve to build a catalog of forbidden activities we generally take for granted. Activities that were all gone and taken away in 2020 during the global pandemic. Again, like I'm making a lot of assumptions here, like, and maybe in discussion we can kind of talk about your experiences. You were young people 5 years ago, right? And I'm wondering about the sense that you felt you were forbidden from these things, or maybe there was, you know, like another way through this pandemic. The forbidden activities generally connect a community, and I feel like that's what Nemesis is worrying about. I'm also interested in the verb form here, both in the passive voice and the past tense. We were is repeated over and over again to communicate the ways in which these forbidden activities were handed to the children of the playground from authority figures who seemed not to be able to check their fear, further reinforcing the sense of vulnerability of the children who became exposed to the traumatic realities of the world around them. So I have a conclusion, and then maybe we'll look at a passage, and I have questions too. So generally before the year 2020, I interpreted Nemesis as an allegory for the concentration camps. I interpreted the wasteland as an allegory for World War I, and I interpreted Mrs. Dalloway as an allegory for coming out of World War I. But we can also think about the way these works represent literal illness. Why do we have to read that illness as a metaphor or allegory? I tended to interpret Nemesis as an allegory for concentration camps. This novel is about how Jewish children are quarantined in their own neighborhoods because the larger Newark community thought they would spread disease. This is a Holocaust trope through and through, and I would love to speak with those of you who are Holocaust scholars about this idea. Like, it's useful, I think, to read this through the lens of Holocaust studies. However, in the wake of the emergence of COVID-19, I once again, as with the modernists, we can now read with a new focus on illness, and am able to read Nemesis to find language for the pandemic we are now coming out of. Worry was everywhere in 2020 and 2021, and Nemesis seems to anticipate that. After we survived self-isolation and illness itself, we worry about how we will confront the next disaster, which could be the result of anything from social and economic disparity, climate change, impending world wars. But it also gives us hope in the possibilities of representation, political representation, and also literary representation. The way a novel or literary work has of giving us language to explain the otherwise inexplicable, a language we can use to communicate with one another across state lines, across national lines, across the ocean. So it is not, I would say, that Auka and Roth had some magic crystal ball that they could look into and anticipate the need to represent traumatic events. Auka in 2019, Philip Roth 2010. A few months before they actually occurred. This is just how history works. History repeats. And it is, quite frankly, how language works. It doesn't change overnight or over years, but we do. We do change. And the associations we have with words can change if the perspective shifts. If we see literary works with a new lens, in order to reframe, as Butler says, to reframe what is grievable. So I've left some minutes for a close reading and discussion questions. We learned last time that you liked the discussion questions first, but here they are last, once again. Some of the things we might consider in terms of like big picture or what's at stake. How does the framing of a text affect the way we read it? How might this be a political, social phenomenon as well as a literary one? How is the literature of war versus literature of illness a distinction that is gendered for the gender studies people in here? What does it mean to think about all of these great texts as being about war instead of as being about illness? And what has been your experience of learning about British modernism, if it's in a curriculum in your departments? Has Auka's reading persuaded you or changed your point of reference? So may we go to a passage and do a double reading to kind of think it through a little bit? Do you want to go to a T.S. Eliot stanza, a Virginia Woolf passage, or Philip Roth from Nemesis? Any preferences? What is it? T.S. Eliot. Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, yes, because we have to read his form also. Okay, so which one? The crowd flowed over London Bridge or the torchlight red on sweaty faces? This one. Yeah, okay. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace reverberation, of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with little patience. That's a great choice. Thank you both. Okay, what do you see when you read this stanza? What words stand out to you? How do they resonate today? How might they have resonated in the 1920s? And, maybe since I didn't do a close reading of this in my remarks, I just wanted to point out that this is a little formal in the sense that, we have a bit of a rhyme scheme. Sweaty faces, stony places. Those are kind of parallel, right? Crying, the shouting and the crying. We who were living are now dying. So we could kind of think about how effective that rhyming is and like how we feel when it's not like a consistent iambic pentameter.
Yes. Ma'am, if I'm not wrong, the poem The Westland was written during the Spanish flu between from 1918 and 20,
Yes.
and which almost killed more than 50 million people.
Yes.
And very interestingly, the poem begins with a very symbolic line.
Yes.
April is the cruelest month,
Yes.
which can be contrasted with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales,
Yes.
which goes like, which begins with, when that April with his showers sweet with fruit. So this phrase, this line is very symbolic, and even in the Indian context, the COVID-19 also started accelerating during the month of April 2020. Yes. So I feel that this phrase and this line, April is the cruelest month, actually captures the trauma, the crisis of that period.
That's great.
Oh, and these are very interesting things. So this term April is very symbolic in very different contexts.
Yes. Do you have the line in front of you? It's like April is the cruelest month.
Yeah.
What's the second one? Awaking desire out of dead land.
Yeah, something like this.
Something like this. Yes. So in April is the rain season where I'm from in New England. And so when it's like raining, raining, raining all of April, we have a phrase like April showers bring May flowers. And then English professors say, April is the cruelest month, as if to say, oh, it's always going to rain in April. And I want to say, that is not what T.S. Eliot meant, right? April is the cruelest month, awaking desire out of dead land. That is like, April is such a tease. It wakes up desire, and then like, what do you do with it, right? Like, this is the world we live in. So that's so interesting, right? Like, as you say, it sets the context for the whole poem. And what would it mean for you to say, like, oh, okay, that means that we are all in spiritual decay. The first line tells us this, right? But as you say, like, it also signals that this poem is about literal physical illness too. And like, if we kind of think about April and renewal, Eliot is saying, you will not get that this year, which is such a nice reading that you gave us. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's someone in the back.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for such a great lecture. Actually, when I came across these lines, I was thinking, if you look upon the title of the poem, The Wasteland, the poem is composed consisting of a broad mythologies, like consisting of Hinduism
Yes.
and Christianity.
Yes.
If you look at the Hindu philosophy, Eliot has talked about the Buddhist philosophy,
Yes.
right? And in terms of Christianity, obviously the Bible, the mythologies of the Bible.
Yes.
In all these lines, what attracts me the most, the last three lines, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. So you see the imagery of death is very prominent here.
Yes.
And these lines remind me of one of the great poets and lyricists in India, Batalvi, Sib Kumar Batalvi. I think he was a Punjabi, lyricist. So one day he was being interviewed and he was asked about life. What about the modern life? So he described the modern life in a single line. Life is a slow suicide. So I remember, like, when we die with patience. So Telius is like pointing to that life has become a slow suicide for all of us
Great.
in today's time, in the modern context. And you see the title, The Wasteland. We see the society has been, consecrated and, associated with morality, ethics, spirituality, and you say sexuality as well.
Yes.
And the poet has reflected upon that. We have lost morality, we have lost ethics, we have lost spirituality. All we are left is with the sexuality.
Yes.
And that's why the world has become the wasteland.
Yes.
And if you read the poem, I like all the 5 parts. In the end, there is a very famous quote, right? Daya, Dayadhvam, Datta, Dayadhvam, and Damta.
Yes.
Daya means, Datta means to give. Dayadhvam means to have sympathy. Damata matlab to have self-control. So the last line is basically commenting on that. We need to have a sort of patience in order to control our desires, because self-control is where the humans lack. And I would also like to point out upon the pronouns that have been used.
Yes.
He who was living is now dead.
Yes.
Maybe the poet is pointing to God. And this reminds me of, Nietzsche quote, the God is dead, actually, right?
Yes.
So he who was living is now dead, which means the lack of spirituality. We who are living are now dying. The poet is pointing to the people. And since with the combination of all the death and all the brutalities and all the darkness, life has become a slow suicide here.
Yes.
So this is what I want to come up with. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's such a convincing reading, right? Like, I feel like we cannot discount the fact that this poem is interested in spirituality through and through. And so maybe it's a little reductive for Autka to say, well, let's look for representations of a physically ill body, a body that is suffering from flu and could die from flu. That seems very basic now, like compared to your beautiful analysis. But what I might say is, like, what would it mean to think those two things together? Because it seems like they are kind of inextricable, right? Like, if we are living in bodies that are sick, that are like falling down, right? What better time than to figure out our relationship with spirituality, to like become like richer people, kind of in our physical forms. So yeah, you're right. He who was living is now dead. That could be read through so many religious contexts, right? And the stories that we tell about mortality, immortality, and spiritual renewal. Okay. I promised you we'd end at 9:40. For the gender point, I just wanted to say, I don't know if you want to like make time to discuss this, but one of the arguments, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through the questions, number 2, one of the arguments that Auka would make is if we frame these poems as poems about war, that is very masculine centered. That is, you know, like guns and ammo, good guys and bad guys. And if we frame it in terms of the domestic sphere, in terms of illness, that gets into very interior spaces. That gets into caretaking, that gets into like being in sick rooms or hospitals. And so there's a feminist argument to be made that if we shift the framework, we can kind of emphasize femininity or the feminine roles, or we don't have to kind of discount the roles that women played in interior spaces and caretaking, and or what it meant for Mrs. Dalloway to feel like she was locked in a room in a sick bed, right? So that's what I was getting at with regard to the gender distinction. I don't need the last word, though. Anything you want to say in response to the literature that we looked at, or the implications of this argument about returning to the Spanish flu? Okay, then if you don't mind, I have just a few paragraphs of closing words because this is my last time up here, and I want to thank you. So I want to end by thanking you so much. I think I can see you all and see this. I've absolutely loved meeting with you every day and learning from you in our large group settings, as well as our individual conversations. From those conversations, I want to share a bit of advice, if I may. Don't wait for a well-known scholar to publish on your idea so you can say you cited an expert for your research. Become the expert yourself. You're amazing close readers. That's been true these last 11 hours, right? I've participated in discussions with you this week. I've read your work and assessments. If we learn anything from Kathy Caruth, let it be this. New thought comes from rereading old texts with a new perspective, a new frame of mind. And please lean on one another and on me and your faculty coordinators. Movements, whether they be the academic schools of thought or political action or community outreach, come with just a few people in a room with something in common and a desire to change, and we are in a room with over 50 people. My trauma network started at Emory University in 1998. The people I work with in trauma studies, Jennifer Hewson, who we talked about, Sarah Sank, Nicholas Ely, Angela Hunter, Jason Jones, Eddie Gamara, are 20 years into their careers now. We are American scholars who came of age as literature majors grounded in the British and American canon. It is time for a new wave. Right? A second wave. And nothing would make me happier than if this wave came from within India. In keeping with the spirit of Gyan, a global initiative of academic networks, we can further connect across the world. Wouldn't it be fun to have a global trauma network? Dr. Shipertolio and others can invite in our German colleagues too. So keep in touch and keep bringing people into the fold. I think we're all drawn to this topic because of a deep sense of empathy for other people. We read closely and we listen closely and we absorb people's stories every day. So I thank all of you. I thank our hosts, Dr. Shipertolio, Dr. Amar Singh, for their inviting me and for all of the work and time that went into making this seminar a success. And I hope you think it was a success. If you can believe it, I grew up a timid girl from the Midwestern part of the United States, afraid to leave my hometown. I'm really quite introverted, if you believe it. I generally do not speak unless I'm asked a question or handed a microphone, which you all have done so generously. And my parents did not travel much or go to college. But I realized in graduate school that the only way to learn about the world is to travel in it and to meet new people and to hear their stories. And I still have a lot of traveling to do. And believe me when I say that this seminar, that meeting all of you to talk about what I love, was a dream come true. So thank you for a warm welcome, for your kindness, and for your friendship, and good luck with your exams today, and we'll chat at the end. So thank you, everybody.